reduced geometric fibers. But there's the first warning. Log smooth maps can have non-reduced fibers. So this is an example of that. If you just take a monoid generated by 3 elements, A, B, and C, with a relation, which is basically so that the underlying scheme will be what we have over there, k x, y, t, quotient by x squared y minus t. And you just take the map from N to P, which only want to see. Then the underlying morphisms of scheme will be this, and one of your fibers will look like in the pictures, which is not reduced. The fiber over T is 0, because, for example, element xy is nilpotent map, so you won't have a reduced fiber. So this is not what we would call a log curve. But what we do include, more than just morphisms, is the same example as Martin gave, is you're allowed to have nodes. So if you take a union of the coordinate axis, then with the log structures that I think Salvatore also discussed, you will get a log curve. Well, the first log structure is just mapping n squared, and S is like a log point, which was also seen before. And I think I might, yeah. So I did copy the picture. We can define like a morphism now by the diagonal map. So a map between the log structures going the other direction. And then this will become a morphism of log schemes. And now you can check that all the log schemes are Fs. Well, we've just given the charts, and they are finitely generated and integral and saturated. And the morphism is also log smooth and integral. And rather obviously, as there is now one, the geometric fibers are connected and reduced and curved. So this will be a log curve, and this is also one of the main examples of what can happen in a log curve. Because what you cannot have is a singularity that is worse than a node, such as in this example. Because, for example, this example will give you a cusp, but this will not be a log curve because we've taken our favorite monoid that is not saturated. Namely, if you take a monoid n without 1, then this will not be saturated. And if you consider the log scheme with the natural log structure, the spectrum of k n without 1, and just over a point with trivial log structure, then what your result, your underlying scheme will be kxy with, well, what is the natural formula for a cusp? And this is basically because the monoid n without 1 is generated by, for example, the elements 2 and 3, but then there is a relation which is exactly this relation. So this is an example where the map will be log smooth, which you can see, as Martin said, the map of monoids is you have the trivial monoid and n minus 1. The kernel and the torsion part of the co-kernel of the groupification of this map are finite groups with invertible order. And this map will also be integral, but this is also not what we call a log curve because our scheme X is, or our map, our scheme X in this case is not saturated. So these are examples of what we do and don't consider log curves. And then there is a theorem by the main article Cato about what log curves really look like. And to read that theorem, we need a definition. So the characteristic is just the characteristic monoid or sheaf of monoids is just quotienting out the units. But you also have something called the relative characteristic, which is defined as the quotient. Oh, I think there's an bar that should not be there. But you quotient out the image of the map of monoid that comes with your morphism of log schemes. So for example, in one of the examples where there was a union of the coordinate axis, then you will just over a point, then the map of monoids was the diagonal map, and then its co-kernel is this. The quotient will be the co-kernel of that map, and it will be the copy of C of Z. So that's what you would call the relative characteristic. And then we have the theorem, which explains what the geometric fibers of a log curve look like. So if you have a log curve over a separately closed field, and then you know that the underlying scheme is nodal. So either it's locally described by a spectrum of KT, or it's locally described by a nodal point, union of two axes. And also, moreover, you know about something about the log structure, namely the relative characteristic. There are some points in the smooth part such that the relative characteristic will look exactly like this. And we already saw that for a double point, your relative characteristic would be C. That was the previous example. So you can also see why at the double points a C should be, it's logical that it appears right now. And here the subscript Ri means that it's the skyscraper sheaf. But there are also some points in the smooth parts which you should think about as markings, which will lead to what the talk is about, the marked, the semi-stable curves, which are marked nodal curves. You used to think of the Ri as the nodes and the Si as the markings. So, I did not know that Martin would do this example, but to get back to Martin's example, this is your favorite picture to have in mind, so maybe I should have known that he would also give this example. But this will also become a log curve, so if we're walking over the Fi line with coordinate t, and well, Martin already looked at an affine patch of this, but you can look inside the P2. You can look at the closed subscheme divided by xc is yt, which will look like this. And this will, you can give this the log structure.
Do you want ty squared or something? Should both be homogeneous.
Yeah.
Okay, just y squared.
Well, I'm not
can,
entirely myself the source of this example, so there was actually a ty. But I do think that's old.
Yeah, like if I wanted to be equation of projective space, I want homogeneous. Yeah.
Yes.
I vote for y squared. Like ty squared. Yeah.
Okay, and then you can give your, well, logically you work on an affine plane, so I chose where Z is invertible, and then you can describe your space X as the spectrum of K with PZ, with P, well, here the monoid generated by 5 elements, and which has relations that C plus C prime is 0, so that's basically the C is for the C, but it should be invertible. So we adjoin C and C inverse. And we have A plus C is B plus U. So
That should be b plus 2 then. Or, no, 2b plus u.
yeah, if you insert y squared, then y in this case belongs to b. So that should be 2b plus u. And then, well, we have a monoid and we can take the canonical log structure associated to it. And then we have made a log curve over the affine line, where we give the affine line the log structure defined by a divisor. T is 0, which is basically just mapping n to kt by mapping 1 to t. And, well, this is an example of a log curve where you can see that above t is 0, it becomes nodal. So nodes can occur. And this will also have some markings, because if you're not above t is 0, then it's isomorphic to p1 with the divisor at 0 and infinity. And this would be your markings, and there's always 2 markings, so the n in this theorem is always 2. It looks like you have a question, David.
I'm trying to. Could you say in the example you were just showing us how you had A, B, C, C prime, and
something.
A, B, C, C prime, and you have X, Y, Z, T, and I guess Z in both.
Yes.
So how do
So
those?
Z and Z inverse are the C and the C prime,
Okay.
and X and Y are the A and the B.
And T is U is the exponent of T, I guess.
Yes. Yes, and so if we would insert y squared, then the b would get at 2b plus u in the relations. Yeah. Okay. And Kato then also gives the theorem that he just gave, that I just gave, was saying something about the relative characteristic, but you can also say something actually about the actual log structure, and he calls this a table of local descriptions of the log structures, which is not really a table, not in the article either, but it basically says that there are 3 kinds of points, which we've already seen. The first kind is a node, the second kind is like a marked point, which is in this case we have set the SI to be those points where the relative characteristic is isomorphic to n, so those are those marked points, which are not necessarily marked points yet, but it could be viewed as. And there's smooth points, so then he writes down what it means around a node, what your log structure looks like, because at a node then the underlying scheme looks like the spectrum of A with xy quotient by xy minus t, where t lives in the maximal ideal of A. And then Kato says that there is a splitting of your characteristic monoid at the point R. As follows, and if you write this enumerated sum, you should specify what the maps are. Well, the maps from n to n squared is just a diagonal map, and the map from n to q is somewhat more difficult, but somewhere in the proof of his theorem 1.3, so the last theorem, he says that there's an element called q0 in q, which has some special property, and then the map from n to q0 is just mapping some n to q0 to the power n. We have seen such an example where we had the map n to k, where we said n would go to 1 if n is 0, and to 0 else, which you could also write as 0 to the power n. And that's what this enumerated sum then means, and then the log structure is described by something which we could expect. Because we also had, in the example where we just had the union of the coordinate axis that the log structure was given by n squared, mapping a comma b to x to the power a, y to the power b. Well, we have exactly a similar thing here. And a tile around one of these marked points, then we can say that the underlying scheme is like just a line, and your point is just the section at 0. And then you can express there is a splitting of the characteristic monoid at the point si given by this, where we just have a direct sum. And a log structure is basically sending a to t to the power a, but then we need to say what our t is, and t is here. The pullback of this wi, but then in ox si. And finally you have a smooth point, and there the log structure is almost trivial. It's also given by q, and q is the characteristic of s at the close point. So just by the map sigma.
Is it really so the map sigma from Q to A, this is the log structure or the pre-log structure? It's the pre-log structure.
It's described by, so usually we take pre-log structures.
Okay, yeah. Never mind.
That's also in all the described by and the lower figures. That's also not the log structure.
Yes, awesome, thank you.
Yeah. But we just take the associated log structure again. So we have that log curves. We know what they locally look like. They can have nodes. They can have these arc points. You could also think the other direction. That's if you start with a nodal curve and of just schemes. So can we then make log schemes x and s so that we get a log curve? And this sounds logical, but and the answer is yes. But you could also ask how many of these log structures you could give, so that there comes a log structure which looks like what you expect it to look like. Because I said in the theorem, if you get a log curve, then you have nodal points and you have marked points, so you want this to coincide with the nodal points and the marked points that you already had. And it turns out that there's a natural, or what they later call basic, way to do this, to give this log structure. And well, there is a procedure, and this is given over a strict Helselian ring. Apparently this is enough. And then we do what we sort of expect to do. We consider around a node a neighborhood, so that it looks like the spectrum of our new favorite ring. And I think this diagram is also on the next slide. And now we can, well, the spectrum of AT and the spectrum of AXYT already have some natural log structures that we've seen coming back during this talk. So that's what we do. We give AT, the spectrum of AT the log structure, or if you just send the monoid n to AT by defining by 1 goes to T. And also the other ring, we also give the logical log structure by sending n squared to, so a comma b to x to the power a, y to the power b. And then together with the morphism pi, the map delta, so the diagonal map of n to n squared, will define a morphism of log schemes. And then well, we have these log structures on the right side, and we can pull this back to obtain log structures on the left side, naturally making the horizontal map strict. And if you pull back the log structure on spectrum AT via phi I, then you'll get a log structure on S. And if you pull back the log structure via psi I, you get a log structure on UI. This is not yet a log structure on X, but if around smooth points you do what you expect to do, or you pull back these Li that you now have on S. So you do actually mostly nothing on other neighborhoods and glue this together. This is not trivial that these things glue together. There's actually pages of commutative algebra involved with completions, and they are lemmas 2.1 and 2.2 in the article by Fumahari Kato. Then you will also get a log structure, which I here call Mi without a prime on X. And then you also, right now you have taken into account the nodes, but you also want to take into account these marked points. And you can just take the log structure associated to the divisor, these marked points, and then make the amalgamated sum of all these log structures. So, which will basically give you around the point exactly what you expect, as in the theorem before. Or around a node, you get exactly what you expect. To give an example of this procedure. Okay, yeah, sure.
Like, I thought if you took like a normal crossing variety or something,
Yes.
then there's an obstruction to putting a log structure. Does this kind of does this obstruction disappear in the case of curves? Is this what you're saying?
I'm not entirely sure what this obstruction is.
I think
David
so,
keeps
yes.
nodding. Maybe that helps.
David
keeps nodding.
Maybe
that helps.
I think that's what it gets.
Okay.
This is what is stability.
I mean, there is some obstruction, but maybe it is some H2 and then you win or something like that. Yeah. But no, I agree that it's not true of high dimensional, high dimensional.
There's really something special about it.
Okay, so the answer is yes, it's something special about curves. I've drawn an example of a nodal, in this case a stable curve. On the left I drew the way I draw them, with the P1 just a line and you have to glue somewhere. On the right I've drawn the picture that people who like to draw P1 as a sphere, like to draw it like that. There's a lot of these people, because I went to a winter school in Frankfurt and they all drew these pictures, so not to offend anyone, I also included that one. But the first one I can put into latte, which makes it preferable to me. And if you would use this procedure, you can see that there will be, there's two nodes in our curve over just a field. So there will be two of these MIs and LIs. And this LI is just pulling back map n to your variable. So you can expect on S, so in this case on our field, for the monoid n squared to appear, and this is true. And you will see that n around, well, at smooth points then it will also be just n squared because you've just pulled back from S. And at the marked points an extra copy of n will appear. And we can check what we've done here with the first theorem, theorem 1.3 in Cato, to check if what you have is correct, and that will be the case. You can also check it with the table of local descriptions of your curve. It will also be like that. But then you can make not necessarily stable, but a nodal curve into a log curve. And Yeah, this is the theorem about it being basic, and that's yes,
The
sure.
previous example, so this is not exactly the block structure that you define its pullback, because you impose a block structure on the base, no?
Who is the base? You mean the point?
As a point, yes.
Yes. Well,
In
the
the
procedure that we
previous-
have gives a
in this
log
procedure-
structure on both x and on s, right? There's two lines at the bottom saying what the log structure at your x will be and the log structure at s. And the procedure that you do here will make this into a log curve. So x over s will be a log curve if you do this.
So what I mean is the log structure that you get on S, here you don't have a choice, right? You get it by looking at the nodal structure.
Yes. And there's two nodes, so yeah, you basically have no point in what happens.
Okay.
This is a procedure and there's one
Yeah,
outcome,
yeah.
but in general log structures are not unique or something. This procedure just gives an outcome, and the next theorem will say that the outcome that you get from the procedure will satisfy some nice properties, that it is actually the logical thing to do, and that's this theorem, which is a bit of a big one. But it says that we started with a stable n-marked genus G curve, and we've done the above procedure, so what we just did. And you get some other log curve, which satisfies that it is on the underlying schemes, so in the next sentence everything is about the underlying schemes. This log curve actually looks like one of these diagrams, but then only with everywhere underlines, and then you claim it to be Cartesian. Then there will also be morphisms of FS log schemes, so that you do get the diagram. And in the middle there is a condition saying that the pullback of the divisor of the marked point in X equals to schematically the divisors of the marked points in X prime, and that's what I mentioned at the beginning, saying how many of these log structures can you put on such a stable curve, so that the answer you get is what you want, namely the marked points in your theorem 1.3 from Cato are exactly those where an extra n appear, and double points are where the relative characteristic making sets appear. And then a log curve is called basic if it satisfies the universal property here. So a log curve is basic if this log curve just has any log structure, but if you then have another log curve such that on the underlying morphisms of schemes you can make this thing come true, then there are unique extensions of these morphisms, A and B. That universal property, if that's satisfied, then you're a basic log structure. And this is sort of important because this theorem, or at least the concept basic, sort of explains why log curves really look a lot like marked or nodal curves, because for every stable n-marked genus G curve there is a unique basic log structure making it into a log curve. So there's really a correspondence here. And then a question that was basically the reason why David volunteered me for this talk. This is the question that I came across, is if you know something about the MGN bar, so the Delay-Mumford rectification. So this is the moduli space of genus G and marked curves. And then the boundary, so these are the not smooth ones, so the nodal curves. The boundary will form a normal crossing divisor. And then you could ask whether in the space MGN bar, you can give this the natural log structure. And also, if you have a genus G and marked curve C over S, then you can also fit it into a diagram like this, where the lower map from S to MGN is mainly just defined by your curve C that you've started with, and the map from MGN plus 1 to MGN is the universal curve, and the map from C to MGN plus 1 is giving C an extra section defined by the diagonal section. And I have a picture of this. But the answer to my question was if we give it this procedure log structure, basic log structure, is it then the same if we would consider log structures on MGN and just pull them back? And yeah, if you just pull them back, so if you make log structures so that the horizontal maps are straight, then these are the same things. And this is the picture of what that would look like. Because in our example we had that S was just a point and our curve was given by the one above. And this curve has two markings in genus 1, so it lives in MGN and 1, 2 bar. And at M1, 2 bar we because each node adds 1 to your deformations, this would actually locally look like this. And right now I've not drawn M13 bar, but I've drawn the universal curve over, which is marked to M13 bar, but maybe not exactly what you would expect from a drawing of it. And in the picture of M12 bar, you can see that it's actually our main basic example, so you can indeed expect it to be n squared, the normal crossing divisor structure. And if we pull it back, then we should get the same log structures as before on your curve and on S. And that brings us to Chris's talk from last time. This is from your talk, so questions should not be directed to Chris. He said at the very end of his talk, very fast, that the main example of this abstract tropical curve metrized by some monoid would come from log curves. So that's what we can do now. And this was the definition of such a tropical curve. You had a set of vertices and edges, and every edge had what you expect to be an edge was now two edges, one in one direction, one in the other. And we have a function r, which is taking your edge to your starting point, which need not be defined, so your edge can go into nowhere. And an involution saying, hey, my edge has a partner with the same length, and it matches those, switches those around. And something called length in your monoid n. And if your monoid was like r bigger than or equal to 0, then you would get what you expect to call a length, just a number. Length is 3.5. That's something. Right now, our length is something in a monoid. And then we also need the definition of a relative tropical curve. Like you want a tropical curve over a log scheme, which is basically you give such a tropical curve as above, so such a graph with the extra data, but you also do edge contractions, which was something that was mentioned in the very last part, and precisely those that will be mapped to 0 in your monoids. Well, right now we can, if we start with a log curve, then you can just, for each geometric point, let xs be the dual graph. And this is what taking the dual graph of such a curve would look like. I discussed that log curves now look like marked nodal curves, so that's what I've drawn. The first one I still tried to draw complex, and the second one I stopped. In general, one would call the dual graph where you would take a node for each connected component, and you would actually give this node a weight, namely the genus, and then you would draw an edge between nodes if there was a node, an intersection of your connected components. And you would draw half edges for your marked points. However, in the article that we are studying, the marked points disappeared, and this is because they consider vertical log curves, and which just means that there are no marked points. So there's no half edges to give a length. That's nice. And they also say that their story won't change a lot if you add weightings to graphs, but they just want to keep it clean and simple, so they also ignore the weightings. So then your picture would just become no mark points and just some intersections. And then you would get a graph like that. And now all I need to define is you take the dual graph, and this is just the graph on which you define everything, but you need to define a length to have this tropical curve thing. And to define a length, I have copied a theorem from the article, which is basically the same as the theorem that we did before, just with different words, and I need a letter from this to define the length. I need the letter delta. So this theorem says, well, what we've seen, a log curve is just a flat family of nodal curves, and in the geometric fibers you're either a smooth point or you're a marked point. But most importantly, what happens at nodes, because the edges that we need to give a length, they are coming from nodes. So we need the third part of the theorem. And if you have a node, then the relative characteristic monoid would be a copy of Z at that node. That's the theorem that we saw. This just describes it a little bit more explicitly, what we can expect. Namely, you add, for an element delta in MSS, and this element delta is going to be the important element, you just consider there is an isomorphism like this, and delta, the invertible sheaf OS minus delta would then be the pullback of the ideal sheaf on the boundaries at Pfizer in a moduli space of curves associated to node X. This is a moduli space, which is just a very, very, very general moduli space, no MGN, but just the moduli space of curves. And we already knew that around the node, this would look like the spectrum of A, X, Y, T, quotient by X times Y minus T. So yeah, what's delta? Locally around the node we have that it is given by this equation for some D, and then delta and D will have the same image in the lower right corner of this diagram. Namely, D is just an element from OSS, and delta will be an element from the characteristic monoid MS. And these will map to the same element. And this delta in this monoid will be your length. And that's, as far as I understand, the tropicalization of the log curve. So for a geometric point, you take the dual graph and the length of an edge is this delta. And well, you also needed to make this edge contraction map in points, local points, and then you just say that it's this edge contracted corresponds to the nodes that are smoothed out. So we had the picture where we locally had the nodal curve like this, and then in the area the node would be smoothed out. So you would lose both a component and the edge between because you lost the node, and that's an edge contraction. And that is, as far as I understand, the tranquilization of a log curve.
Maybe I should say that I might go into this a bit more.
Oh, okay.
So
To be continued. Okay, and that's what I wanted to say.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I was waiting for David to say something.
He generally has questions.
Does anyone have any questions?
So could you go back to the slide where you first drew this two-gon thing with the, yeah, that guy. So in this picture it looks like the mark points and the nodes look very similar. They both have n cubes, but the map from the mono downstairs I think looks kind of different in both cases.
Yes.
Can you tell us what it is? Is that?
Yes, I could. Not that my shoulder can.
Would you like me to write? If you tell me what to write, I'll write.
No, but then I'll just have to talk giving.
Okay, sure.
From n squared at a node, it looks like the diagonal map on one copy of your n squared and just the identity map on the other copy. Then you get n to n squared to n3. But on the I thought around the mark points you would map n squared to on one component you just map to 0, and on other components you just do the identity.
So this is why you get, so even though you get the same stalks upstairs, the relative characteristic is n of the markings and z
Yes.
of the, yeah.
Yes, if you take these maps, you can check your answer by, because if you have the diagonal map, then we saw that the co-kernel would go to Z, and then your relative characteristic also will get it C here, while on the other one you just get an N.
Maybe I have a question. So these log structures that you're putting on stable marked curves,
Mm-hmm.
was the statement that if you map your stable curve into the compactified moduli space, MGN bar,
Mm-hmm.
and MGN plus 1 bar, that the log structure you defined earlier is always just the pullback of this log structure?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And then somehow the point is that you can change the log structure on S if you like, and then you kind of, this gives you possibly some new log structure on,
Yes.
on X.
Yeah. Then
But
the lower, no, when they won't be strict anymore if you change it on S, but you
Yeah.
can take the pullback of the
Yeah.
log structures. Yes.
does anyone else have any questions?
Yes.
So we at some point we switched from talking about general like nodal curves to talking about stable curves, but it wasn't clear to me where we actually needed stability. Like it first came in this theorem about the basic log structure, and I see that Kato also assumes stability, but I don't. Do you have any like?
I think this stability mainly comes in because he used it later. He wants to make a logified MGN bar.
Yes,
So he wants a
gonna talk about that a bit as well. Like I'm gonna talk about the tropical MGM bar, basically. And for that to be nice, we need stability.
Okay. But for this normal crossing divisor business, you don't need. I mean, the stack of pre-stable curves still has a normal crossings boundary, and I think this just all goes through it. Then I don't see what would go wrong if you just told the whole story in
So
that
one
context.
problem is that it'll be like infinite dimensional, because you can just pass subdivide edges infinitely and you get infinitely many length. So it's not going to be a very nice space. I think that's the main reason.
But I mean, the stack of pre-stable curves has a fixed genus and a fixed number
Yes,
of points as a constant.
at least tropically, so because you have this extra information now at each node, at least so tropically, each node gives you an extra dimension. It is an extra parameter,
okay,
so
it's
it
okay.
gets larger and larger. So I'm going to go into this in more detail, but basically the stratification of